There is a kind of guilt that doesn't come from doing something wrong. It comes from wanting something more. It appears quietly, almost politely, right at the moment you allow yourself to imagine a different life. A life with more silence, more space, more rest, more truth. And instead of excitement, your body reacts first. Your chest tightens. Your breathing changes. A familiar discomfort settles in. You don't feel joy. You feel tension. And almost automatically, a thought appears. I should be grateful. I already have enough. Others have it worse than me. And suddenly, wanting more feels wrong. But stop for a moment and listen carefully. What if this guilt has nothing to do with gratitude? What if it has nothing to do with morality, generosity, or kindness? What if this guilt exists because, at some point in your life, wanting more became dangerous? Dangerous to love, dangerous to belonging, dangerous to staying emotionally connected to the people you depended on. Maybe you learned that when you wanted too much, something changed in the room. A tone shifted. A look hardened. A silence appeared where warmth used to be. And your body remembered that. So your desire learned something essential. It learned to lower its voice. It learned to whisper instead of speaking, to hesitate instead of asking, to wait instead of moving. It learned to scan the environment before existing. And guilt became its guard. Guilt began to appear every time desire tried to rise. Every time you imagined a different future. Every time you felt the impulse to choose yourself. And guilt would say, softly but firmly, careful. Don't ask for too much. Don't disturb what is stable. Even when what is stable is slowly suffocating you. This is why so many people feel guilty for resting, for slowing down, for saying no, for wanting a life that feels lighter than the one they are living. They don't feel guilty because they are selfish. They feel guilty because they were trained to survive by shrinking. They learned that love was easier when they were smaller, quieter, and less demanding. So now, as adults, they apologize for their needs. They minimize their desires. They stay silent to keep the peace, even when that peace costs them their inner life. If you have ever felt uncomfortable for wanting more peace, more love, more meaning, more life, if you have ever felt the need to justify your exhaustion, to explain your sadness, or to hide your dreams so others wouldn't feel threatened, this episode is for you. Because your desire is not a flaw. And this guilt is not the truth. No one ever sits us down and explains that love can feel conditional. We don't learn this through clear explanations or rational conversations. We learn it slowly, emotionally, through the atmosphere around us. We learn it when affection subtly changes its tone, when warmth becomes distance, when presence turns into a kind of emotional silence that we don't yet know how to name. As children, we are extremely sensitive to these shifts. We may not understand them, but we feel them in the body. We notice when a smile disappears faster than usual, when a voice sounds colder, when attention suddenly feels fragile and uncertain. When you were calm, adaptable, and undemanding, love felt closer. The environment felt safer. The emotional tension seemed lower, even if nothing was explicitly said. But when you needed too much, when you asked for more attention, more care, or more understanding, something changed. Sometimes it was obvious. Sometimes it was subtle. But it was enough for your nervous system to register it. Maybe you were told to stop complaining. Maybe you were reminded to be grateful. Maybe you were praised for being strong, mature, or easy to deal with. Your mind did not analyze these moments logically. It stored them emotionally. And slowly, a silent rule began to form inside you. A rule that didn't need words to exist. Desire creates tension. Need creates risk. Asking for more threatens connection. In psychoanalytic terms, this is where the internal authority begins to take shape. An inner voice that observes you from the inside, that evaluates what is acceptable and what is not. This voice is not the voice of your adult self. It belongs to an earlier time. A time when love felt uncertain and belonging felt fragile. So your psyche adapted in the only way it knew how. It learned that shrinking desire could preserve connection, that asking less could reduce emotional danger, that silence might be safer than expression. And now, years later, every time you want more from life, this old internal voice returns. Not aggressively, not cruelly, but firmly. It tells you to be careful, to not disturb what seems stable, to not ask for more than what is already being offered, even when what is stable is slowly draining your energy, even when what is familiar is quietly suffocating your inner life. This is how guilt learned its role, not as a punishment, but as protection. A protection that once made sense, but may no longer serve who you are becoming. No one ever sits us down and explains that love can feel conditional. We don't learn this through clear explanations or rational conversations. We learn it slowly, emotionally, through the atmosphere around us. We learn it when affection subtly changes its tone, when warmth becomes distance, when presence turns into a kind of emotional silence that we don't yet know how to name. As children, we are extremely sensitive to these shifts. We may not understand them, but we feel them in the body. We notice when a smile disappears faster than usual, when a voice sounds colder, when attention suddenly feels fragile and uncertain. When you were calm, adaptable, and undemanding, love felt closer. The environment felt safer. The emotional tension seemed lower, even if nothing was explicitly said. But when you needed too much, when you asked for more attention, more care, or more understanding, something changed. Sometimes it was obvious. Sometimes it was subtle. But it was enough for your nervous system to register it. Maybe you were told to stop complaining. Maybe you were reminded to be grateful. Maybe you were praised for being strong, mature, or easy to deal with. Your mind did not analyze these moments logically. It stored them emotionally. And slowly, a silent rule began to form inside you. A rule that didn't need words to exist. Desire creates tension. Need creates risk. Asking for more threatens connection. In psychoanalytic terms, this is where the internal authority begins to take shape. An inner voice that observes you from the inside, that evaluates what is acceptable and what is not. We usually believe that guilt exists to punish us, that it appears because we did something wrong, said something wrong, or wanted something inappropriate. But psychologically, guilt often has a very different function. It exists to prevent loss. Loss of love. Loss of connection. Loss of belonging. When love once felt fragile, guilt became a strategy. A way of keeping bonds intact by keeping desire under control. Guilt works quietly. It doesn't scream or accuse. It whispers hesitation. It appears right before you make a decision. Right before you ask for something. Right before you choose yourself. It creates doubt. It slows you down. It makes you reconsider what you already felt was true. Not because your desire is wrong, but because, at some point in your life, desire felt dangerous. This is why guilt feels so powerful. It is not just an emotion. It is a memory. A memory stored in the body, reminding you of what once happened when you needed too much, wanted too much, or took up too much space. In psychoanalytic terms, this is what we call relational guilt. It is not about morality. It is about attachment. It belongs to someone who learned that being too visible, too expressive, or too demanding could threaten connection. That is why guilt appears when you rest, when you slow down, when you stop being productive, when you stop being useful. That is why guilt appears when you say no, when you disappoint someone, when you choose a different path. Not because these choices are wrong, but because they challenge an old internal rule. Stay acceptable in order to stay loved. Your guilt learned to intervene early, before conflict, before rupture, before separation. It tells you to endure instead of choose, to adapt instead of express, to remain instead of leave. And for a long time, this strategy worked. It helped you stay connected. It helped you feel safe enough to survive emotionally. But survival strategies are not meant to last forever. What once protected you can eventually limit you. What once kept you connected can later keep you trapped. The problem is not that guilt exists. The problem is when guilt becomes the only voice you listen to. When every desire is filtered through fear. When every choice must first pass through permission. When your life becomes a negotiation instead of an expression. This is when guilt stops being protection and starts becoming a cage. And part of emotional growth is learning to recognize when an old defense is no longer serving your present life. Desire is often misunderstood. It is frequently confused with greed, impatience, or dissatisfaction. But psychologically, desire comes from a very different place. Greed tries to fill an inner emptiness without ever feeling complete. Desire, on the other hand, moves you toward life. It pulls you toward what feels meaningful, alive, and true. Desire is movement. It is direction. It is the part of you that wants to grow, expand, and breathe more freely. When desire is welcomed, it organizes life. It gives energy, motivation, and a sense of orientation. But when desire is silenced for too long, something changes inside. Desire does not disappear. It turns inward. It becomes anxiety that has no clear source. It becomes irritability that seems disproportionate. It becomes a quiet sadness that follows you even on good days. Many people believe they are unhappy because something is wrong with their life. But very often, they are unhappy because their desire has been frozen. They learned, early on, that wanting too much created tension, that needing more disturbed the environment, that expressing longing could threaten connection. So they learned to stop wanting, or at least to stop noticing that they want. They learned to replace desire with duty, with responsibility, with productivity. Desire is one of the first things we learn to negotiate. Long before we understand what we want, we learn whether wanting is allowed. We learn this not through explanations, but through consequences, through tension in the air, through emotional withdrawal, through subtle signals that tell us when we are asking for too much. Over time, desire begins to feel unsafe. Not because desire is wrong, but because it threatens balance. And balance once meant survival. So instead of following desire, we begin to monitor it. We question it. We dilute it. We postpone it. We tell ourselves that it is not the right time, that we should be more patient, that we should be satisfied with what we have. And slowly, without noticing, desire stops being a guide and becomes something to manage. But desire does not disappear just because we stop listening to it. It changes its language. What once spoke as longing begins to speak as anxiety, as restlessness, as a sense that something is missing, even when life looks complete. Many people are not unhappy because their lives are objectively bad. They are unhappy because they have learned to live without inner movement. They replace desire with obligation, with responsibility, with being useful, reliable, and acceptable. They became very good at functioning, and very distant from feeling alive. And guilt plays a central role in this process. Guilt keeps desire quiet. It reminds you of the cost of wanting more. It tells you that asking for more time, more space, or more care is excessive. So you stay, you endure, you adapt. Not because you are weak, but because once, adapting kept you connected. Over time, this creates a very specific kind of emptiness. Not the emptiness of loss, but the emptiness of absence from yourself. You may feel tired even when you rest, disconnected even when you are surrounded by people, unsatisfied without knowing what you are missing. This is what happens when desire is silenced for too long. The body does not forget what the mind tries to control. It speaks through tension, through exhaustion, through a quiet sadness that has no clear explanation. Desire was never meant to be eliminated. It was meant to orient you toward life. Ignoring it is not neutral. It has a psychological cost. And sooner or later, something inside begins to ask, not loudly, but persistently, is this really the life I want to be living? When guilt appears, we rarely stop to examine it. We feel it, and immediately assume it must be right. Guilt arrives with authority, with a tone that feels serious, responsible, almost moral. It does not ask questions. It gives orders. And because it has been with us for so long, we treat it as a guide. But guilt was never meant to guide a life. It was meant to protect a bond. Guilt was formed in moments where connection felt fragile. Moments where love could be withdrawn. Moments where being too honest, too expressive, or too demanding felt like a risk you could not afford. So guilt learned to intervene early. Before words, before choices, before desire could fully take shape. It learned to stop you before something bad could happen. This is why guilt feels so convincing. It carries the memory of danger. Not a danger you can clearly explain, but one your body remembers. When guilt appears today, it often has very little to do with the present situation. It is not evaluating reality. It is replaying history. It reacts as if you were still emotionally dependent, as if love could still disappear overnight, as if being yourself were still a threat. This is why obeying guilt feels familiar, even comforting. Obedience once kept you safe, but staying with guilt instead of obeying it means doing something different. It means allowing guilt to exist without immediately acting on it. It means noticing how quickly it appears, how it rushes to silence desire, how it tries to restore an old balance, and then asking yourself, slowly and honestly, what am I actually afraid of right now? Not in theory, not morally, but emotionally. Am I afraid of disappointing someone? Of being rejected? Of being seen differently? Of losing approval? Very often, these fears belong to the past. They are echoes of relationships where love required adaptation. But you are no longer living inside those dynamics. Listening to guilt without obeying it allows desire to breathe again. Not impulsively, not recklessly, but honestly. It allows you to choose based on truth, instead of fear. And that shift, slowly repeated, is what begins to loosen guilt as control over your life. If you feel guilty for wanting more, it does not mean that something is wrong with you. It means that, at some point in your life, you learned that wanting less was safer. You learned that shrinking yourself preserved connection, that adapting protected love, that silence avoided conflict. And for a long time, this worked. It kept you connected. It kept you included. It kept you emotionally safe enough to survive. But survival is not the same as living. What once protected you may now be limiting you. What once kept you safe may now be keeping you distant from yourself. Desire does not disappear simply because you learn to control it. It waits. It changes shape. It finds other ways to speak. Sometimes it speaks through exhaustion. Sometimes through emptiness. Sometimes through a quiet sadness that appears even when everything seems fine. This is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of honesty. It is the part of you that knows that life was not meant to be endured forever. It was meant to be felt. Releasing guilt does not mean rejecting your past. It means recognizing that you no longer live inside it. You can honor the version of you that learned to shrink, without continuing to live as that version. You can appreciate how guilt once protected you, without allowing it to make every decision for you. Desire does not demand recklessness. It does not ask you to destroy your life. It asks you to listen, to notice what feels alive and what feels empty, to recognize what nourishes you and what slowly drains you, to allow yourself to want without immediately punishing yourself for it. This is not about becoming selfish. It is about becoming honest. An honest life is not always easy, but it is coherent. And coherence brings a kind of peace that obedience never could. You may still feel guilt. It may still appear. It may still speak with authority. But it no longer gets to decide. You can acknowledge it, understand where it came from, and still choose differently. Little by little, this changes everything. You stop apologizing for your needs. You stop minimizing your desires. You stop asking permission to exist. And in that space, something quiet but powerful happens. You begin to feel present in your own life. Not because guilt disappeared, but because it no longer controls you. And that is where life begins again.